Hey guys, welcome back to the Going Deeper podcast. In today's episode, I am having a conversation with Griffin Gooch about happiness. I was connected with Griffin through my editor at Baker Books. We both have books coming out around the same time on a similar topic. So Griffin, he is a writer, a speaker, a professor, and he's currently working on his doctorate in theology at the University of Aberdeen. And his work has been featured in Christianity Today, Fair Forward, Christ and Pop Culture, Mere Orthodoxy, and Inkwell. And he also writes regularly on his Substack, Reality Theology. So you guys are in for a treat today. I pray this episode blesses you big and encourages you in your walk with the Lord. Griffin, thank you so much for joining me. For those who are maybe not familiar with you or your work, just tell us a little bit more about who you are.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I started following Jesus when I was 18, and then from that moment on, I decided that I needed to invest in that in whatever way I could. And so I started out trying to be a worship leader, and then that didn't really work out. So then I wanted to become a theologian instead. And so now I'm currently working on my doctorate in theology at the University of Aberdeen. And in my free time, I write a lot. It's just what I feel kind of called to. And so so I write a lot about like the intersection about like theology, psychology, and things along those lines. And right now I'm currently working on a book about happiness, which is how we got connected.
Yes, and I've actually really enjoyed your Substack. So if anybody is listening and they like Substack, I've really enjoyed the sort of your writing style, but also the topics that you cover. So yeah, we connected with Eddie, our editor at Baker Books. So just tell us just a little bit, like give us the elevator pitch of your book.
Okay, so in the first like 10 years of my following Jesus, I kind of had this idea that it meant that happiness wasn't essentially available to us in this life, that even though Jesus like promised us the abundant life, all of that stuff about, happiness and joy, that was basically going to happen after we die or, in the new heaven and the new earth after Jesus comes back. I didn't
Right.
really necessarily understand that that was a thing that we could just access now. And
Mm.
so for the most part, I kind of when I would get into seasons of like sadness or depression or anxiety or fear or worry or just general suffering, I would kind of interpret that less as, oh, this is something that's like bad. And I would kind of think of it as like, oh, this is like a good sign. Like it is a good sign that
Yes.
I'm suffering or that I'm
Yeah.
somber or that I'm not actually experiencing joy right now. Because if I was experiencing joy on earth, that would mean that I'm not actually following Jesus very well. And so I kind of walked around with that mindset for almost 10 years. And then I started to read some like the early church fathers like Augustine and people along those lines. And I found that a lot of them were talking about happiness as if we could just have it. And then even crazier is that some of them, like especially Augustine, was talking about how, you know, all human beings, we pursue happiness. It's like one of our natural instincts, right? And so when Jesus came, he's giving us a roadmap to happiness, but it looks super counterintuitive from how we might normally think of happiness. But, when Augustine kind of like comes along and does like all of his philosophy and figures it out, he's like, Jesus is essentially giving all human beings a roadmap to perfect happiness in the here and now. He's showing human beings how they can live the best kind of life. And so he's basically connecting this universal human longing for happiness to the way of Jesus. And hearing that, I had just never, like in my entire life, I've never heard any sort of Christian talk about Jesus or church or anything along those lines as if it could actually fulfill our longing for happiness. For the most part, I've just heard about it as in people saying, hey, sacrifice your happiness, sacrifice all the things that you enjoy, the things that give you life, and then you'll get some, goodness or the treasures in heaven, right? But not for right
Yeah.
now.
Yes. Yeah. You had called that the deathbed paradox, which I was like, oh, that's good. So personally, I had very similar experience as you, sort of like God wants you to be holy, not happy. Or I've heard people say happiness happens. Or I've heard somebody say happiness is a feeling, joy is a fruit. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah, no,
believed a lot
absolutely.
of that. And I think to some extent there is some truth to that, but also I think the case that you're making in your book almost makes it hard to even view happiness in that way. So, you know the hymn, "Turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full into his wonderful face, and all the things of the earth will grow strangely dim."
Yeah, yeah,
But then you've got, I think it's Joe Rigney, whose book, Strangely Bright. Have you read that or heard of
yeah.
that at all? And that book just kind of flipped that idea on its head because I thought, "Huh, I've always thought the same of, if you're not suffering in this life or if you're not serious or whatever, it's like, yes, joy, right? But that's this sort of deep-rooted, it was just sort
Yeah,
of
yeah.
coded with this theological language, and it wasn't this. No, it can be a feeling, it can be a genuine emotion, and maybe it sits side by side with suffering or sadness, but it's still very real and accessible. So I love that. Why do you think that misunderstood or warped view of happiness, why do you think that it's so prevalent today?
Well, I think a lot of it kind of stems from the way that Americans define happiness way differently than how, Jesus or, the early church fathers would have thought of happiness. So I guess, like, I mean, big background on there, so I'll just try to summarize it in broad strokes. But somewhere around like the 16th and 17th century, people stopped thinking about happiness as like fulfilling your calling in your life or fulfilling your destiny or living in accordance with virtue or, honoring your family or something like that. And they started thinking about it more as in fulfilling your internal desires. So basically following your authentic self, following, your momentary pleasures or, any impulse that you have along those lines. And so the definition of happiness started just switching around. So whereas it used to sort of mean this kind of like you're living in almost like a congruence with the way that God designed you, or even if you weren't a Christian, you could say like the way that the gods or whatever beings were out there were designing you or whatever. But later on, and now especially in America, it's like one of the most common beliefs that we have in our culture is that happiness is more about fulfilling your momentary desires, being true to yourself, and basically getting exactly what you want, when you want it, all the time, right? And so I think a big part of why churches, especially like in the past 100 years, because all of this like talk about, you know, uh, God wants us to be holy, not happy, or joy is a fruit of the spirit, not happiness. That stuff didn't really exist in church language up until the past like 100 years or so. It's a very like new and relative phenomenon. And so most churches are probably just kind of reacting to the way that the way that moderns sort of have an obsession with happiness, as opposed to really basing it off of a deep theological truism. And so I think that's a big part of it. And then on top of that, it's also just kind of hard to make sense of all the suffering passages in the New Testament. I mean, there's so many mentions of suffering, but part of the again, the difficulty in seeing through that or figuring that out is like it's not about suffering for the sake of suffering. It's about suffering for rejoicing in God, suffering so that we become stronger, so that we grow towards Him, so that we see God more in our daily life and that we walk in step with Him more and more. So it's not about suffering for the sake of being somber or sad or anything like that, but it's suffering for the sake of becoming more and more like Jesus as we grow progressively towards Him. And so I think a lot of these things just work together to make us feel just confused about it.
Yeah. Well, I want to go back to it's so crazy how our books have overlapped and there's so many parallels because the chapter 2 that I was just working on was very heavy with history and sort of philosophy, and I was essentially asking the question of like, how did we get here? And the instinct that I had was that, well, we've drifted from truth. But then I was like, okay, but how? And because I didn't pay attention to history class, I really had a lot of work to do. So I kind of to what you were talking about, I started to see how, okay, so back in like the pre-modern period of time with like Aristotle and Augustine and all of that, their happiness was, or even just the good life was very centered around virtue. And it was sort of a morale, and it was ethics and guide, like a life guided around, like you said, either it was God or the gods. And then you kind of see this shift happening around like the Enlightenment and the Renaissance,
Yeah, yeah.
and you've got like the modern period. And I thought, okay, this is so fascinating, which is when sort of the idea of authenticity began
Yes,
began.
yeah.
And I was like, "Wow, okay, so it's like you know something is true, but then we start to look at the history as to why it's even a thing. It starts, you can connect the dots, and then the fast forward, of course, to postmodern period with, you know, World War II and just the technology and individual all of the things layered on. I was just like, well well, no wonder we've gotten to where we are today and our definitions of everything. We're so far from truth, and we can just invent definitions to anything
Yeah.
nowadays. And so the case that I make at the end of chapter 2 in my book was that if we can be allowed to redefine sexuality as an example, why can't we redefine something like happiness or the good life or whatever you want to call it? Anything that is maybe a lighter topic, even though it affects our day-to-day life, we can be allowed to redefine that. We can say, you do you or whatever makes you happy. It's just this very relativistic idea, and it's not
Yeah.
grounded in any sort of objective reality. And so I love that you mentioned that. I wanna hone in on the whole God doesn't want you to be happy, he wants you to be holy idea. Uh, why do you think that that line resonates so much with people?
It gives you a very it offers this deep sense of like calling or seriousness. It gives you this idea that if you are pursuing holiness and not happiness, it's like you're being strong, you're being brave, you're being courageous, you're going against your base desires or whatever, and it kind of gives you this sense of like duty, and so but that's great, like in a sense where it's like, we should be holy. Holiness is, what we're essentially pursuing. We're, trying to set ourselves apart from the world, becoming more clean, more like God and everything like that. But, in the process of, pursuing just holiness as if it's like diametrically opposed to happiness, we actually do end up sacrificing a little bit of holiness in the process. Because, I mean, if you look at, some of the greatest saints and martyrs and, just Christians throughout history, some of them definitely had mental health struggles, and some of them were definitely sad or somber here and there. But for the most part, most of them were so joyful. I mean, if you met a monk, or even if you just go to a monastery, most cities today still have monasteries. You can just go to a monastery, meet one of them. There's a great chance that they are not somber, sad, depressed, or anything like that. There is a great chance that they are so enraptured by God that they are living in a constant state of joy, which is essentially the end result of, following God, of loving Him, of serving Him, all of these things. It's the abundant life that Jesus gave to us. And so when it it's just this kind of issue of just trying to say that holiness is just totally opposed to happiness. They should go hand in hand. Like, as you become more holy, you should become more happy. And as you become more virtuous, like you were saying with like, this is one of the things like Aristotle and, Plato and stuff, they already picked up on this even before, Jesus hit the scene, is that if you pursue virtue, if you, learn to love more, to live with more courage, to live with a greatness of soul, or like any of the other virtues that they were talking about, you will live a more happy life because you are, following good morals. Like, being a good moral person will make you more happy. But then, obviously Jesus, when he comes on the scene, is like, it's not just virtues, it's not just morals, it's not just working to try to become something more. It's like it's me, it's living like me, it's following me, it's accepting me, and like walking in step with my spirit. That's like the missing piece that you guys are not working with here. And so, yeah, kind of took us in a little rabbit trail there, but in general, like, holiness should not be opposed to happiness, because as we become more holy, we should also be growing in happiness, because the virtue that we gain through becoming more holy should make us more happy in the process.
You have a quote that I stole from your book that I think I might have made a note on, and it was, "Maybe the pursuit of happiness is our natural instinct because if we follow the impulse far enough, we might just find ourselves closer to practicing the way of Jesus." And I think that that captures what you were talking about with Plato and Aristotle, where it's like, okay, they're pre-Jesus, so they don't, and they weren't even because weren't they in Greece? Weren't they even Greece? So it wasn't even like they weren't even connected to Jewish culture, so they didn't even know the Jewish God. So they're just kind of going off this sort of human understanding that God has sort of put into all of us, and they're
Yeah.
pursuing that and they're coming to the right conclusion, but they don't have the missing puzzle piece, which is Jesus and his spirit, which is kind of cool to understand that. But this concept of joy, like I think I've done a word study on joy. Is it kara? Is that how you say it?
Yeah,
Kara?
kara, or the verb is kara.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And my understanding when I did a word study on it was that it was this sort of deep-seated gratitude and, sort of overwhelming thankfulness for our salvation and for God and who he is. What would you say to people who maybe have disconnected this sort of maybe theological joy and just happiness, or disconnected those 2 things?
Yeah, well, I always find this interesting because if you ask somebody, like, if you're just like, give me a definition of joy and when you feel joy, and then give me a definition of happiness and when you feel happiness, it is going to be so similar.
Similar,
And it's
yeah.
really hard to find any difference between the two. And so, when talking with I did some interviews and stuff for this book. So when talking to people, most of them will say like joy is when you help somebody cross the street or something. Like just an example of like being a service sorry, a
Yeah.
serviceable presence or something like that. So that is like joy for them, but then happiness, they're like, oh, it's when
Like a cheeseburger.
yeah, something like that, like a quick dopamine rush or something like that. So it's almost like they think of joy as like, the oxytocin or the serotonin from helping somebody, and then, happiness is the dopamine from having like a drink of alcohol, or, being at a
Mhm,
dance party or something like that. And so I think it's like, all right, there's a somewhat of a distinction there, but like if you really trace it back far enough, like there's
mhm,
not that much of a difference. And so to say that like
mhm.
joy is this entirely distinct concept that has nothing to do with happiness just isn't true. And so even if you go back into, actual the Koine Greek in the New Testament, you'll find that in general, like when it's talking about, joy or delight or gladness, blessing, all of these kind of words that have to do with
Synonyms.
happiness, they're for the most part used like synonyms. Yeah.
Interchangeable,
Yeah,
yeah.
like interchangeable, right? And so, when, again, when people try to, make a sharp distinction between the two, it's for the most part, it's like this modern idea of trying to separate them. And for the most part, they're doing it because our modern conception of happiness is so different
Different.
from what we would think of in the Bible.
Mhm,
And so they
mhm.
want to paint it as so different. And it's like, okay, I can see where you're coming from, but like we would have to redefine happiness to be like a happiness according to the flesh, which is like, happiness that comes from dopamine or giving into your base desires or something like that. And then like a happiness according to the spirit, which is like joy, delight, gladness, all of those things on the other hand. But in general, it's just the feeling and experience that's in happiness, and the feeling that an experience that's in joy is not that different that we can draw such like a sharp line between it.
Yeah, yeah. I learned this when I was reading your book. I was like, "Huh, well, okay, so your book and" what was the book you recommended me? I think it was just called is it Randy Alcorn,
Yeah.
Happiness?
Yeah, that's a good one.
That's a heavy book. I
I know.
I
They spent
thought,
like 5 years on.
"Whew." I was like, "I didn't realize this was a textbook," essentially. But I did start of make my way through it a little bit, and he was the one that kind of explained that if you look at all of these words, they really can be used interchangeably a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And I didn't even know that, because I think to your point, our society, we do have we would define happiness and joy maybe differently, but that's probably a more newfound thing. I wanted to touch on they just popped in my mind thinking about your book. I want to talk about the Beatitudes, because I know you kind of say that, especially when we were just talking about, Aristotle and Plato and how, back in the pre-modern period, their version of happiness was sort of virtue. And they were saying, if you really follow, the virtues and love and courage and all these things, you're going to become happier. And then Jesus comes on the scene and is like essentially, yep, I'm that sort of answer that you're looking for. But it's upside down. It doesn't make any sense. People are like, "What do you mean blessed are the poor in spirit? What do you mean like blessed are the meek?" Or all these things that are not considered blessed or good things. And I loved how you said like the beatitudes are essentially Jesus's pathway to happiness. Can you just talk more a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I was talking with my doctoral advisor about this because we were discussing these ideas, and so he was saying that the ideas that Plato and Aristotle had, they were just floating in the water, and so there are these ideas that were all around Jerusalem, were all around like the ancient Near East, that the basic human desire was happiness, that like everybody was kind of on a hunt for it, and by this point, like 200-300 years after like Aristotle had actually been on the earth teaching these ideas, people just kind of accepted it. It was just like this natural thing. But even still, like people were realizing that Aristotle's plan kind of failed. Like it was a good starting point. Pursuing virtue is great, but it can't bring you the full way along. And so picturing that just being in the water, being in people's like minds and stuff. And then Jesus shows up in the scene after he's anointed by the Holy Spirit, sits on the side of a mountain and gives like the inaugural address of the kingdom of
Hmm.
God. And he starts it off by saying the word makarios, and the word makarios is blessed in our English translations, but the idea of makarios is essentially this God-given happiness. So Aristotle is using the word eudaimonia or eudaimon, which is essentially like a man's happiness or something like that. And then Jesus says like a God-given happiness, like perfect happiness, a happiness that can only come from the gods. So it's like this is like an actual like fulfillment. This is a true like prophetic moment about the human condition, what is coming to you, what is going to happen, what is the true nature of reality. And so when he says blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, blessed are the merciful, the pure in heart, all of those things, he's basically saying like all of the ideas that you have had about happiness, everything that has been floating in the water for these past 200 years, or even since like man started, walking the earth, like they are not like ideas of happiness that you're working with are not full, they're not complete. You are working with like an idea of happiness that is just according to your flesh, essentially. Like, because if you are just following your happiness instinct, you'll still like feel unfulfilled at times. You'll still end up chasing wealth or honor or prestige or anything along those lines, pleasure, but you're not actually going to find what your heart is truly longing for. And so when he says like these lines are crazy. Like even at the
They
time,
are.
like
They're ridiculous.
I know, and we think we think they're weird, but I'm just like letting everybody know this was weird at the time. This was shocking. This was not what anyone was expecting by any stretch. And so for him to say, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted," that's an insane concept. It's saying the God-given happiness belongs to those who mourn. But the more that you actually think about it, I mean, there's lots of scholars that say like this is essentially just advertising the availability of the kingdom of heaven. That like anyone is allowed to have it. You don't need to be a blessed person. You don't need to be like, you don't need to have parties every night. You don't need to be like a person of high renown. You don't need to be from like a rich family or anything like that.
Hmm.
And so that's definitely part of it. But at the same time, if you really think about what he's saying is blessed are those who mourn, as in happiness belongs to those who mourn. So the person who mourns is a person who is being sobered to reality. So think about like
Yeah.
losing
Mm.
somebody that's close to you, and how much that actually makes you reflect upon your own life, reflect upon your choices, reflect upon the person that you have become. There's some verse in Ecclesiastes, can't remember what chapter it is, but it's like it's better to go to a funeral than it is to go
Yep.
to a wedding, which
Yeah.
is another weird sentiment, right? But there's something in actually attending a funeral. There's something in actually dealing with loss. There's something in actually processing grief where we actually come to see the things that truly matter. And so even though it'd be fun to go to a wedding, it'd be fun to go to a party, and it'd be fun to do all of those things, Jesus is basically saying like that state of mind, that state of mind that you're in when you're mourning, when you're actually sober before how you're really feeling, that is when you are truly facing reality. That is when you're reflective. That's when you are seeing things as they should be. And that's when you're going to be more and more open to the ways of God, because you're going to stop seeing life in the span of like, how can I get to the next hit of pleasure? And instead you're going to start thinking like, how can I live my life in a better way that's going to leave my family, my friends, the people around me happy at my funeral, rather than like,
Mm.
feeling
Yeah.
distant or something along those lines. And so every one of those blessings from the Beatitudes, right? Every one of them is just signifying the actual way to live a blessed life. And it's insane. I mean, again, all of it is so weird, so over the top that
Course.
it's
Yeah.
backwards. It's not what you would think of happiness. But Jesus is like the one who is pure in heart, the one who is innocent, that person is blessed. The one who makes peace, like that's the one who is blessed, which is insane because, in natural human instinct, we want revenge. We want to conquer other people. We want to, take things from other people if they take from us, but rather than trying to get revenge or come out on top, he's like, actually, you will be much happier if you just try to make peace, not just with you and your relationships, but like with the world around you. The more that you can pursue peace and the more that you can create it, the happier you will actually be, even though it doesn't seem like it.
Right. Man, there's so much good that you said and all of that. I love that you uh, admitted like these are some crazy weird statements. I think that can affirm somebody out there who's read them and been like, "What?" There's also it makes me think about I think it's the second portion of chapter 2 that I was reading when you were talking about sort of this idea of how what we've learned over time is that the more and more and more that humans pursue happiness, the further we get away from it. But, when it comes to Jesus, what you find is that the more and more that you pursue Jesus, the happier you become. And so can you talk about a little bit about that of how like when your goal is to be happy or even all of these platitudes nowadays like create a life you love. So like let's just say that happiness is a life that you love to wake up to, which is just the stinking quote you see all over the place, and it has this image that's connected to it of like family vacations and passive income and no problems financially, and it's just it grinds my gears, which is
Yeah.
part of why I'm writing a book on it. But, that's sort of this end goal, and that end goal has this label over it of happy. But yet, what we see when we look at history is that the more and more that you make that your end goal, the farther you actually get from happiness.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I totally agree with that. Yeah, so it's very strange. So I mean, this has been studied a ton by psychologists. They found that, essentially the person who is the most obsessed with happiness, and again, one of the issues with psychology is like it has rough definitions of everything. So it's like what happiness is to one person might not be what happiness is to another person, but that's like a whole can of worms. But at the same time, the people who are most obsessed with happiness, the people who want it the most, often end up the furthest from it. And it's very strange, but it's like if you are valuing your own internal state of being more than anything else, you are drifting away from happiness because happiness is not a state that can necessarily be like achieved or arrived at in a sense. Like, basically when we're talking about happiness, I know some of the early church fathers, they thought about this too, but they thought about happiness being more of an activity rather than something that you just arrive at. And it's not like this like state of being where you're just like, if I get enough money or if I get the passive income or the family vacations or anything like that, then I will achieve this perfect state of happiness, or just to have an aesthetically pleasing life in every realm, then I will be perfectly happy. It's like the people who live with that kind of mindset will be the furthest from happiness because happiness is not something that it can necessarily be like grasped or achieved, but it's something
Same.
that it's an activity, it's a way of
Mm,
being, which is why practicing the way of Jesus is one of the best ways to find happiness because you are literally putting yourself in the perfect framework of actions, of thoughts, of feelings, of pursuits that is actually landing you inadvertently into happiness, essentially. And so, yeah, I know it's one of the it's one of the strangest things. And so, the scholar J.P. Morelands and Klaus Isler, their whole definition of happiness, they have a great like theological work on happiness, but their whole definition of happiness basically boils down to Jesus's verse: "For those who want to save their life will lose
well,
it, but
yep,
those who lose their life and find it
for
in
my
me."
sake. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and for those who want to lose their life for my sake will find it, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's what it is, and you said that the were they scholars? And that was sort of they would say Jesus's verse for happiness. Is that
yeah,
what you said? Yeah,
yeah,
that's crazy. I think I go back to that verse all the time because that verse as well there's a lot in the New Testament, of course, there's plenty of things that Jesus says and that Paul say that are very backwards, and when I read them and when I read them and then I like set them up to our culture, I'm always like how are we thinking that what we're doing is is following Jesus. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You know, because I'm like, he's calling us to do some really crazy things, some very radical things. And, and going back to that quote, the platitude of like, create a life you love or whatever. And I'm not trying to harp on that. It's just this terrible thing. But it does kind of seem a little bit incongruent to Jesus's like lose your life. Right? Like this one over here is like cultivate this, aesthetically beautiful, pleasing life that you want to wake up to. And Jesus is like, go to your grave.
Yeah.
But I think the beauty in all of that is that what he's trying to get, and this is something that I've been like thinking about a lot recently, is that Jesus through his death and through his resurrection was essentially and when he calls us to deny yourself or to take up your cross or to lose your life, he's essentially saying that like, follow me into death, but by following me into death, you're going to follow me into resurrection life as well. And that's where the abundant life is in the resurrection life. It's like, so you don't stay in the grave, right? You're not, but you have to go through the process, and that's a daily thing too, which is a whole nother can of worms because that's really hard to implement in practice.
Yeah.
But speaking of that, to sort of like land the plane of all of this, the abundant life, I feel like that's a very elusive idea sometimes because, in some translations it says um, everlasting life or eternal life, which kind of connects to your deathbed paradox where you're like, okay, so this is only in the heaven that I'm getting this sort of life, this abundant life. But in other translations, it's abundant life or life to the full. And I think even the Message translation says like a better life than you could ever dream of. And so this whole Jesus saying, the enemy has come to steal, kill, and destroy, but I've come to give you life and life to the full. That's for here and now, not just for eternity. But how do we actually practically live that out? Like, what does that look like practically?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, that's like the entirety of the
Loaded
book is
question.
about.
Loaded
Yeah.
question.
So, in general, I mean, the first step is, losing your life for his sake and then taking up your cross daily, which is a
Mm,
little addendum that Luke in his gospel he adds to that verse is taking up your cross daily, which is essentially, taking up a thing that ev- taking up a like cultural sign that you are weird or that there's something wrong with you because that is what a cross was in their day, right? So taking up that every single day. So another way to translate that is basically denying yourself, dying to your own pleasures or your own pursuits every single day so that you can find it in him and so that you can see clearly and soberly what God wants for your life, because what God wants for your life is actually going to bring you abundantly more joy than anything else you can possibly imagine. And so that's the general like first step
right.
there.
Right.
That's the basic thing. But I mean, one of the issues with that is, I mean, I've known that verse since I, became a Christian, right? But I've spent most of my Christian life unhappy. I was not fulfilled. I was not like
Mm,
satisfied in anything. I did not.
wow.
When I would hear like pastors, talk about how joyful it was, I just almost didn't believe it. I was like, this is something that we say for like evangelism or something, or if like there's a new person visiting church, but it's not something that we actually live out and believe, right? Or
Wow.
experience. And so trying to actually come to a deeper understanding that happiness is possible through Jesus and not just possible but is perfected essentially. Well,
Mm,
not like fully perfected, we can't be
right.
truly completely
Yeah.
unadulteratedly happy in this current life because that'll come in the next life, but still like we can live life to the full now. We can live the best kind of life. We can um I happy saints, right? And
Mhm,
so
mhm,
the process of getting there is essentially just reordering every aspect of our lives to come under Jesus's lordship. And so I
mm,
break it up into three categories. So the first category is essentially just pleasure. I think we were talking about this a little bit in the intro or a little bit early on. But another one of the things that was really drove me crazy about Christianity was I was like, I could not understand how, we were supposed to, like suffer and live a very somber life, but then like what do we do with food? Like how do we make sense of like drinks? How do we make sense of like exercise or games or anything along those lines or like anything that could cause pleasure? And so I had to kind of understand that every one of those things, all earthly pleasures can be received as gifts from God. And so trying
yeah.
to take trying to just build a framework along those lines,
Right.
especially that
Yeah.
when pleasures come into our lives, if we are, putting a distance between ourselves and those pleasures, or actually experiencing those pleasures to, their
Mhm.
nth degree, um,
Mhm.
it's almost like rejecting God in a sense. There's this weird verse in the beginning of First Timothy 4 where it's like, don't let any, I think he calls them people who are demonized or something. They're going to tell you that you shouldn't, marry, or you
Yes.
shouldn't eat certain foods, right? But that is
Mhm.
false. Like anything that you receive is made clean through your prayers and through you receiving it with thanksgiving. And so, whereas I came up in a church where it was essentially like I didn't have a framework for how to enjoy food or pleasure or fun or anything like that. It's like I had to build a kind of mindset where any sort of pleasure, any sort of anything that was within the confines of God's good
Right.
creation, right? Because
Right,
obviously
right.
there's a
Sinful pleasure, right. Yeah. I'm
there's
following you.
yeah, there's a line. But all of those things can be made holy and sanctified through receiving them with thanksgiving. And so I came up in a church where it was like you couldn't enjoy pleasure, and you should basically reject it. But I found that the more that I looked at it, the more I was like, if we reject every good thing that God puts in our life, that is probably just as sinful as rejecting everything
Yes.
that
And
God
that's
puts in
sort
our
of
life.
what Joe Rigney talks about, and that's sort of where I've been trying to embrace personally in my life, the tension of the sort of look into his full and wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim, but also they will grow strangely bright. And I don't think that those have to be like I don't think you have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think that those like two things can be true at one time. I think that we can look into Jesus's face and be, fully enamored with who he is. And there is truth to everything just falls into its rightful perspective. And you're like, in comparison, I could go without these things and I would be happy without them. But on the contrary, those other things, we shouldn't just throw them out and be like, "Oh, I don't want them, we can't enjoy the pleasures." I think that those also should serve to point us to Jesus
Yeah.
and to serve as a way um to just foster gratitude, but also I think with the right framework, like you were saying, they help. I think for me, they're practically speaking, they're ways to constantly reorient my eyes toward Jesus, and like I think it's very evident for me. The best example that I have is my children, like when I'm in a day, like let's say that it's like been a really, really hard day, but then all of a sudden out of nowhere, there's like a lot of laughter and giggles. I'm like, I'm very happy. But immediately I think, good Lord, thank you for these children. Like these are the biggest blessings. And they themselves help me like reorient myself to God and kind of come back to reality in a sense of like you described earlier, it's the most real thing is that to look at your kids and be like, he gave them to me, he created them. And it just kind of puts the entire, story of God in right perspective in those moments when you are thinking rightly about things and you are reorienting the joy or the pleasure and the happiness to the one who gave it to you. So I love that. Okay, you said pleasure's one. What's two and three?
Okay, so the second one is meaning. So it's essentially finding, like, a lot of philosophers and psychologists and stuff, they basically divide happiness into two categories where it's basically pleasure and then meaning. And so meaning is like our relationships, it's serving, and it's work or vocation or things along those lines. And so the second portion is just making sure that everything in our life that has meaning, as in like our relationships, our work, things that we're working for a purpose, we're serving God, we're following our calling, making sure that all of those things are, again, ordered rightly and pervaded by the love of God. And so
Mm,
making sure that all of our work, whether it's, being like a janitor, being like a doctor or something like that, no matter what we do, just doing it all to the glory of God and trying to make
mhm.
sure that we're not, I mean, this is one of the hardest. I mean, most of my friends that are like in their 20s or something, the hardest thing that they are dealing with right now is just feeling like they don't have worth because their job isn't like flashy or something like that. That they're, working as a construction worker or a barista, and they're thinking that they're
Mhm.
not actually serving God because their job isn't flashy. And that's just so unfortunate because most Christians throughout histories were farmers or smiths or all these jobs that were not
Yeah.
luxurious or
Yeah.
illustrious or anything like that.
Yeah.
And so trying to build like a theology of work as in like we should find meaning and we should find our God-given calling and we should realize that we are honoring God by just meeting him in all of our places of responsibility, whether it's something really flashy like you're on a stage every weekend, or whether it's just something like you are doing laundry or just working as a barista or anything like that. Like in all of those things, we are serving God. Like they all jobs essentially have an equality with God. And then the
Yeah.
second portion of that would just be relationships. It's we need them. Like I've heard a lot of Christians make this point where it's like, oh, all we need is God. And it's like, that's true. But if a baby is born and does not have a mother or father,
Yeah.
it will not be fine without God. And there's even just like those haunting studies that have found that like if children don't have enough like actual physical touch or attention throughout their early life, they can actually die, which is
Mm.
terrifying and haunting.
Yeah.
And no
Yeah.
matter what age we are, though, like, I mean, that's obviously we need people much more desperately when we're, infants, but even when we're 80, we need other people. It's
Mhm.
so crucial to who we are. Like, we cannot make it
Mhm.
very far without friends. And so, whereas our modern society is more trying to get us to all to become like, essentially worker bees, people who are addicted to our phones, who are alone, um, you know,
Yeah.
uh, binging entertainment or scrolling or something
Yeah.
like that
Yeah.
apart from community. It's like we need to remember that we have to have connection, we have to have relationship, and then building a good community around those values.
Yeah. I think, I really am a big fan of Paul David Tripp, but I think one way he described that was that, like, your faith is a community project, and he was just talking about that nowadays, and the problem is that and it's a lot of this stuff is just, like, inherited. This is just the hand we've been dealt. We haven't just been like, "I'm gonna wake up today and be an individualist." We are a part of an individualistic culture
Yeah.
where independence is very like an elevated virtue, and even just our suburban lives, there's just so many aspects of our culture that we just will never be able to just flip a switch and change. But the consequences of that is that we've sort of uh created this understanding that our faith, and this was actually part of the reason why I walked away from the faith in college, and I had to relearn things. I have had to do that over the years, but primarily why I walked away from the faith in college was that I thought I had to do it alone. Was trying to go at it alone. I had no sort of mentor. I had nobody discipling me. I was just going to church and trying to make it on my own. I had no friends who were pouring into me or discipling me that were walking with Jesus. And I just thought, okay, I see everybody else doing this whole Christian thing. I'm going to try and do it. And, I tried to stick to a Bible reading plan on my own. I tried to maintain a consistent prayer life on my It was just this very independent faith. There was no communal aspect to it at all.
Wow.
Zero.
Yeah.
And I do think that that was like the missing piece to my faith. Because now I am like the polar opposite where I'm like, I have a very wonderful community, and that's an aspect that, like, God has truly blessed us with,
Oh,
but
good.
it's vital. Like, I can't even keep up my own Bible reading without my friend Nikki, who studies along with me and holds me accountable, right? Like,
Yeah.
so I was destined to fail in college my own. And so I love that Paul Tripp said, like, your faith is a community project and it's not meant to be done alone. And so I think if anybody's listening and they're just really struggling, if you're trying to walk with Jesus and it's just you and Jesus, that's not going to work. And I love that you
Yeah.
said that relationship is huge. And I was convicted when I read that because I think you said, you said people say happiness is God, and you're like, I think that that sort of limits the idea. I think, yes, God himself is the embodiment of complete happiness, but we don't just only need God. He's given us multiple other things that we do need. He created, man and said, like it's not good for you to be alone. And
Yeah, yeah.
I love that you mentioned that. So was relationship the third one, or what was the third one?
The third one is growth. So it's pleasure, meaning, and then growth. And so that's the part of happiness where it's more like just a practicing. And so there's one author who even just talks about the whole Christian moral life as just practicing happiness essentially. And so in one way or another, it's more of like we have to take our basic daily schedules and just regiment it towards God in one way or another, whether it's, spending rhythmic time in prayer or scripture study or, confessing our sins to our friends or hanging out in community or whatever it is that we're necessarily doing. It could be resting, with family on the weekends or something like that. All of these things could be a spiritual discipline, but it's just
Mm,
making sure that all of the disciplines that we have in our life, that we're ordering them around growing in a certain direction, and that simple process of just growth, of getting out of our comfort zone, of challenging ourselves in one way or another, actually provides us so much joy and so much happiness. And that's one
yeah.
of the reasons why like Christianity can provide so much joy, and why like even though there are some Christians who are really somber, a lot of my friends are extremely joyful. And it's because like yeah, they have good jobs, they have good marriages, they have, a loving family and good kids and a good church, but they also have so much more than that. And it's like this daily battle essentially, trying to resist vice, resist sin, and pursue righteousness. It provides so much meaning. And that constant process of growth actually will provide so much life and joy and so much, I don't know, just beauty in life. It gives you energy. It gives you a reason just to get out of the bed in the morning with just a sense
Yeah.
of purpose.
Yeah.
And so that third aspect is like growth. And so, whereas most people are like pleasure and meaning, I think the third aspect of growth is just my absolute favorite, where it's like we have
Really?
to view like our lives in Jesus as if we are constantly growing, you know?
Mm.
You
Yeah.
never want to, anyone who is in a place in their life where they're stagnant or they're drifting or they're regressing, that is not a happy person. That is
Not
not a
no.
person who is living to God's glory, right? There's nothing good that comes from drifting, right? But people who live with intention, followers of Jesus who have a mission, have a goal, have a calling, and they know where they're supposed to go. They're like setting their compass somewhere. That is like man truly alive. That is a human being who is living with a true and beautiful joy in their lives.
Mm. That's really, really good. There was something that I wanted to note, and it's slipping my mind. I don't know if it's gonna come back to me. That's okay. I would love to know, actually, this just popped into my head. I would love to know, you kinda said that for a large portion of your walk with the Lord, you were unhappy. I know you struggled with, like, you talked about depression and mental health and different things like that. What would you say what would you say if somebody is, like, struggling with depression or mental health or anxiety or just, a state of unhappiness and they're a Christian, like, what would you encourage them with?
Uh, it's gonna, this might sound a little bit weird, but I would encourage them to practice gratitude, to wake up in the morning and thank God for 5 things in their life. I would ask them to see their friends regularly, especially when they don't feel like it. Because I mean, somebody who's struggling with depression does not wanna see their friends, but, I mean, that's
Yeah, they
one of
don't.
the absolute most important things that you do, and the more that you
Mm,
cut your depression is just a cycle, right? So the more that you feel depressed, the less you want to be around people, and unfortunately, sadly, a lot of the times, it's the less people wanna be around you because it's, repellent
mm,
in a sense, which is very sad.
yeah,
But, I mean, do whatever you can to get out of bed and to go to talk to people, just to be around others. Third, go on a walk, no phone, no anything. Enjoy nature, enjoy God's creation. Something about that process literally will take you
yeah,
out of your own head. And a lot of depression
mm,
is just being stuck in your own head. You're not able to get past the momentary anxieties or worries or fears or loathing or anything like that.
yeah,
But just going on
yeah,
a nature walk or a beach or just anything, anything just out in the world where you're just not connected to any internet, phone, and just sit and talk to God, that will get you out of your head in such a beautiful way. And then, fourth, I would just say serve other people. It's just
mm,
volunteer. It's one of the things that is unfortunately really low with Gen Z right now is we're pretty low on volunteerism, which is very sad, you know? And so the fourth thing I would just say is volunteer your time. The act of just doing something beyond yourself, of getting out of, your own head and trying to help others, whether, you're volunteering for a homeless shelter or volunteering for church or just, giving of your time altruistically in one way or another, that
Mm.
is going to do so much good for you in the long run. And again, all four of those things, I realize if you are actually struggling with depression, none of those sound fun, but they are necessary. They are going to help you in ways that you can't even see because in the current state of mind that you're in, they probably don't make sense, but they will.
That's really good. I'm so glad you said that, and it made me think of what I was trying to say. What I was gonna say previously was that, you know, I always think about this. I think about Paul and that he wrote many of his letters from prison, and I ask myself sometimes, like, what could you be happy in prison, right? Could you be joyful in prison? And when I read, I remember we studied through I think it we just studied through 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and like 2 chapters, the first 2 chapters was just Paul talking so like joyfully about he was so encouraged by their faith.
Yeah.
And I remember reading that, and truth be told, initially, I was just like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so bored." Like,
Yeah, yeah.
"Why are you so excited about" I don't know. That's just the sinful flesh part of me that was just like, "You're going on and on about how excited you are about their faith." But then, of course, the Holy Spirit convicted me, and I'm like, "Why are you not that joyful or excited about, pouring into somebody else and seeing their faith grow?"
Yeah.
And that was I think about when you were talking about volunteering and just serving and getting outside of yourself to help somebody else. Essentially, part of me thinks that that was part of why Paul was so joyful in prison was because he could see the sort of this purpose beyond prison in helping other people grow in their faith of Jesus.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Yeah, altruism. I think that that's definitely a missing piece, and I think to the topic of depression, even anxiety, because I've struggled with anxiety really bad in the past, is when you're in your head and you're only thinking about your struggles or your circumstances, it is very helpful to get outside of your struggles and your circumstances to look at the world around you and be close with other people who are also walking through things. And just knowing that you're not alone is very helpful in helping you get out of sort of those places. So yes. I want to, your book, when does it come out?
It's not going to be until May or April of 2027.
Right. Okay. So mine, I think, is June, which is crazy that it's such a long
I
process.
know. I had no idea about that.
I'm very grateful for it, though. I'll be honest, because I'm like, whew, okay, I'll got a little bit of time.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, 100%.
How much have you written of it?
I would say I have 8 chapters basically done, and then, I still need to, like, refine the last 4.
Okay. Has it been a hard process for you or?
Yeah, I have to set, like, deadlines for
Yeah.
myself, and so, I mean, that's the only way that I basically get any
Yeah.
writing done, and so
Yeah.
I've been stressed, but it's like I did it to myself in a way because I knew I had to motivate my yeah, so it's like an anxiety that I personally put on myself because I knew that if I didn't do it, I would actually not get stuff done.
Yep.
So I will say
Yep.
it's been hard, but almost because I did it personally.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I felt that too. I felt that too. I have to have a deadline, and I do get off track, and then I'm like, well, just gonna write another 4,000 words now.
Yeah.
Okay, so where can people find you? I think what Substack, you're on Instagram, right? Where else are you?
I'm pretty much only on Substack and Instagram right now. If you follow me on
Okay.
Instagram, you're basically gonna see 1 post per year. It'll probably just be like an update about like
Yeah.
writing or a picture
Yeah.
of my wife or something like that. But
Yeah.
Substack is like the only one I'm actually
Yeah.
active on. And so
Oh,
you can
and you write a ton of articles, which I'm gonna link quite a bit of those in the show notes, and I'll include your Substack as well in the show notes. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This was such a great conversation.
yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was a pleasure.